how do we see access control in the container registry? So first of all, Compliant Kubernetes uses Harbor as its container registry, and Harbor defines for the purpose of access control two particular concepts. So for human access is introduced the concept of user and groups. And if you need to access the container registry via some kind of IT systems, such as your CI/CD pipeline or the Kubernetes cluster itself, then you would rather use what Harbor calls robot accounts. And when we are configuring Compliant Kubernetes for you, then, sorry, I forgot to mention that users and groups don't need to be created in Harbor. Rather, they are extracted from your organization's identity provider. So you can actually choose to have a one-to-one mapping between your organization's users and your organization groups and those that are being understood by Harbor, and to basically build access control inside Harbor on your existing IT policies. And then robot accounts, they do not exist. They're not extracted from your identity provider. Rather, they exist only within Harbor. And what we are doing when we're setting up Harbor for you is that one of your groups is being sanctioned as the privileged group. This is also called the Harbor System Administrator group. So this particular group is a little bit more privileged, and it can manage permissions for users. It can create robot accounts. It can create projects and basically control of the access control in Harbor. Now, I need to start with a bit of a demo disclaimer. So in my particular demo environment, since I just have one user account in our identity provider, I'm actually going to bypass that admin group that I just talked about, and I'll log in via the Harbor admin user, which we're usually not doing, but I'm doing it in this particular case. And in that case, I just logged in, and Harbor likes to group container images into projects. And this is pretty much a logical grouping that needs to make sense to you. So you might have projects per team, you might have projects per application component, you might have projects by, say, front end, back end, or back office and front office, and so on. This is something that really you need to decide, and depends very much on how your application and your organization is structured today. And then Harbor also has users. So these two users, for example, this is mine and my fellow architect, Lars. They have actually not been created in Harbor, but rather they have been extracted from the identity provider of our organization. And they have been created dynamically by Harbor when we first logged in. And then similarly, just as with users, you can also have groups that have been dynamically created based on the groups present in your identity provider. So let me now go ahead and create a new project. So this is the view that I'm getting as the Harbor administrator. It's a very privileged account. Normally, you wouldn't give this much privilege to all of your developers. So I'm just going to create here a new project called demo. I'm not going to make it public. I'm not going to set any kind of storage quota for it. And I'm just going to click OK, and it's being created. And then let me add myself, like my real self, as somebody that can actually use this particular project. And I'm going to make myself maintainer of this particular project. Let me create a robot account. So like I said, the users and the groups that you're seeing are identifying humans, hopefully from your identity provider, the organization-wide identity provider. But if you need to integrate Kubernetes clusters or CI/CD pipelines, those are not really humans, but those are machines, and they should be identified as such with Harbor. So in that case, I would create a new robot account, and I'm going to call it demo1. I'm not going to give it any expiration time. I'm going to say that it's allowed to, it's given, let me reset the permissions. I'm going to give it access to pull artifacts from all of the repositories. Basically, what I'm configuring here is that this particular robot account can only pull from the container registry, but it cannot push or initiate a scan or anything like that. And let me maybe give it really little permission so that it can only access this particular project and nothing else. Yeah, and this looks about right. So I'm going to add it. And it's very important to remember this information because this is the only time you will have this secret. So pretty much you should already now take this information and push it somewhere else in your CI/CD pipeline or in your Kubernetes cluster or whatnot. For now, I'm just going to export this information to a file, and I'm going to show you later how to actually use this information to configure your Kubernetes cluster accordingly. Okay, let me now go to show how Harbor looks like from the developer's viewpoint. So this was the Harbor admin viewpoint. And now I'm going to actually use the organizational ID provider from us. So we're using Google as an organization. And I'm going to log in with my individual user. And there you can see, for example, that I have been correctly identified as myself. I do have access to the demo project, but it's currently empty. There is absolutely no image here. The last thing that I wanted to show is we had a discussion about robot accounts. So when I typed Docker login, I logged into Docker with my identity, with the identity of Christian, with my human identity, so to speak. And one of the first questions that we're getting from our customer is, okay, but I need to give access to the Kubernetes cluster to this container registry. How do I do that? And of course, there is the temptation of just using that same account also for the Kubernetes cluster, but this is not really okay because in that case, basically the Kubernetes cluster takes your identity. And this means that, for example, if I'm looking at the logs and seeing who has done what, then it won't show as it will show as if I am pulling images from the Harbor registry and not that the Kubernetes cluster is pulling images from the container registry, which of course means that the audit logs are now not quite correct. It's not with what actually happens. The identities are distorted. So in order to avoid this phenomenon, we just created a robot account. And let me just briefly show you how to configure that in your Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to do the same thing, running the terminal on one side and then documentation on the other side. And the first thing that I recommend customers whenever they're interacting with the Kubernetes cluster is to make sure, are they on the correct Kubernetes cluster? So here I'm going to have to log in via OpenID to my Kubernetes cluster. And this is again, my identity as a person, as a human by the identity provider. And I know that these nodes are correctly identifying the Kubernetes cluster that I planned to interact with. Let me just make a quick check that the namespace is also the correct one. And yes, I am. The current Kubernetes context is set so that demo1 is the namespace I would be deploying to. So in that case, the next step would be to configure a so-called pull secret. And the way I do this is that I would just set, let me check the file that I have just downloaded. Okay. And then I can copy this information. So the username is robot1, and then the password that identifies this particular robot account is this particular secret. And now I can create a pull secret in Kubernetes by just copy pasting this particular command. Yeah, of course, this already exists because it's a demo environment. Let me delete the past secret and show you that it actually works. Okay. And then I just type this particular command, and then a pull secret is created. And now I have two ways of using this pull secret. Either I need to configure all of my deployments to say like, well, in order to get access to that image, you need to use this pull secret. Or what I'm recommending, just to get the pull secret topic out of the way, you can configure the default service account in your current namespace to, by default, consider using the pool secret that you have just defined. In that case, you don't need to worry about pool secrets anymore anywhere else in your application. So let me do just that. And again, no change because I have already configured this previously in my cluster. And now, whenever I'm creating, whenever I'm referencing an image from the container, from the Harbor container registry in the Kubernetes cluster, it will just find the correct pool secret and be able to communicate with the cluster.